Today's episode is about triggers in grief. Do you know what that means? If you answered no, or maybe, or I'm not really sure, then today's episode is for you, because I'm going to teach you what a trigger is and how to recognize them in your grief journey. You may not yet be aware, especially if you're in the early stages of grief, those first 2 years, what exactly is triggering you. We're going to explore potential triggers and how to evaluate the impact they're having in your life. Because, friend, being intentional about your journey includes understanding your emotions, how to manage them, because being aware of your emotions, and especially the origin, is a huge step in finding that peace you long for. I pray something I say today touches you and impacts your grief journey.
This is Teresa Davis, your host of the Grief Mentor podcast. Welcome to Season 2, where together we will journey through the hardships that grief thrust upon us while holding on to the anchor that is trustworthy and true. Here you will find interviews and biblical truths that speak healing into the mind, body, and spirit of the brokenhearted. I'm so glad you're here.
Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Teresa Davis. Your grief journey has many moving parts, and your grief is as individual as your thumbprint. That's why I created the roadmap for grief. The layers of grief are confusing with many twists and turns. You need a compass to guide you through each one. Today, we are discussing one of the 6 topics. These modules will lead you step by step down this road of grief. It will give you the tools you need to find peace in the chaos, to reach that place where you can live again with purpose. What are you waiting for? Today's the day to make you a priority in your grief journey. Go to the show notes, find the link, and make a decision you will not regret. Now let's get to it so you can learn the 4 steps necessary to learn to manage your triggers. I had some painting done this last winter, and this past week I was mopping the floor in the dining room. I kept going over the same spot, but it wasn't clearing away. So I pressed harder on the mop, thinking that would do the job. My dad called that elbow grease. You ever heard that one before? But despite my best effort, it still didn't come up. So I bent down to see what it was, and as I got close, I realized it was a speckle of paint. And not only was it a speckle of paint, but it was in the exact place on my dining room floor where I was on my knees cleaning when I got the call from our daughter-in-law 4 years and 11 months ago that Andrew's plane had not arrived in Chicago as expected. This was 4 years and 11 months ago. But in an instant, I was back in that moment, reliving that day. That, my friend, is a trigger. A trigger is a psychological stimulus that promotes involuntary recall of a previous traumatic experience. Let me say that again. A trigger is a psychological stimulus that promotes involuntary recall of a previous traumatic experience. I saw something that stimulated me to recall a memory. It was involuntary. I had no idea it was coming because of a previous traumatic experience. The death of the one you love, regardless of the circumstances behind their death, is traumatic. And in sudden death and death by suicide, that adds an additional layer of circumstances for triggers. Now let's dig a little deeper. Let's talk about some examples of triggers and how to recognize them. So, what brings on a trigger? What is that psychological stimulus that brings on a trigger? It can be a sensory reminder, such as a sound, or a sight, like what happened to me, a smell, a physical sensation, a memory, music, an experience, or even the time of day or a season that elicits a reaction. Now, in the roadmap for grief, I get into much more detail, helping you flesh out your triggers based on the death of the one you love. The way your loved one died brings specific circumstances to the table that must be managed individually. So for today, we are going to work through how to define them and how to recognize them. So we've already given our definition of a trigger. Okay, it's a psychological stimulus that promotes involuntary recall of a previous traumatic experience. So how do you recognize or know what your personal triggers are? First, you need to make a list, or at least try to recall when you reacted to a sound, a sight, a smell, a physical sensation, a memory, experience that puts you right back in the moment of your loved one's death. At least try to recall. If it's happened to you more than once, it'll be easier to recall, but at least try to recall that one time. At first, when you're learning to identify your triggers, it may not be clear what brought on that reaction. So in those circumstances, you need to take a look at the common denominator in those circumstances. If you've had a reaction that you couldn't explain, that puts you right back in the moment of your loved one's death, then take a look at the common denominator. What do you see in those circumstances? For instance, what was happening around you when you felt those feelings? Where were you? Was there a conversation taking place that caused you to recall a memory, and maybe you weren't able to voice that to the people that you were with in that moment? Is there a person that being in their presence makes you feel emotions that you don't understand or increases your anxiety, but you really can't just put your finger on it? You don't know why, but just being around them makes you feel a lot of angst on the inside. Try to journal at least one time that this happened to you and try to answer those questions, because that's the beginning of learning to be able to identify your triggers. Okay, let's talk about a few potential examples. The smells inside of a hospital. Now, I'm an RN, and so I never really could smell what other people smelled when they walked into the door. But if you're not a medical person, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Hospitals have a smell. So the smell inside of a hospital can be triggering if your loved one died there. It can manifest by causing you to be uncomfortable when you want to go visit somebody in the hospital, but you really don't realize why it's making you uncomfortable. And your family might think you're making excuses that you just don't want to go, but actually you don't really understand or connect the dots that you don't want to go because you don't understand why you're having that angst and that feeling. Okay, example number 2. Most of us can recall exactly what we were doing when the news came, as per my story today. Often the time of year, the time of season can be very triggering. I'll use myself here as an example. Andrew died in the fall. Because of that, I used to dread the calendar creeping anywhere near fall. As soon as the calendar August faded into September, my mind would be on repeat. That fall is coming. Fall is coming. What am I going to do? Fall is coming. Because in my mind, fall equals death. The sights and sounds and smells and time of the year plastered everywhere you look. It doesn't give much opportunity to ignore that not only is fall approaching, but then comes all the holidays. And then for us personally, that includes January because that's Andrew's birth month. So how was I going to continue to live my life from September to January every year if I didn't learn to manage my triggers? Let's recap for a minute because this is a lot of information and I don't want to lose you here. We've defined what a trigger is. It's a psychological stimulus that promotes an involuntary recall from a traumatic event. Okay. Number 2, we've explored some potential triggers based on your circumstances. All right. I'm teaching you to learn to recognize and identify your triggers. Remember how we said to do that? You're going to think of a time when you had a reaction to something that you didn't see it coming. You had no idea that you were going to react that way, but something triggered you and you reacted to it and it put you right back in the moment. Remember the things that we talked about that you needed to investigate. What were the common denominators in those circumstances? right? What was happening around you? Where were you? Were you in the middle of a conversation and somebody said a triggering word that put you in that moment? Was it a person that made you feel that way? Try to remember and write down the experiences that you had. And I want to interject this here. If you are new in your grief, this may not have happened to you yet, but it's going to, sister. It's going to. It's going to be at your least expected moment. You might be watching something on television. This is a common triggering moment for many of us. We see things and we link it immediately. It puts us right in that moment of our loved one's death. Or we hear something, puts us right in that moment of our loved one's death. That's what I'm talking about. Learn to recognize those triggers, because once you can pinpoint your triggers, then you can do the last step, and that's evaluate the impact that it's having on you, and then you can make a plan going forward, because the degree of impact that it has on you determines the plan. Okay, there's some simple things that you can do, just like I did when I was telling you in my story. I recognized the trigger, I took myself through the steps that I learned, and I removed the threat. But not all triggers are created equal. Okay, some can have a much bigger impact on us than others. The range can be mild. It can move from just having a reaction, a startle reaction. It can move to a panic attack, and it could even become more severe than that. All right, some may be more obvious and predictable, while others may hit you like a tidal wave. Some are hidden and sneaky and sneak up on you unexpectedly. But once you can identify your triggers, then you can evaluate the type of impact that it had on you. And then we can make a plan for you going forward. In the module, Managing Triggers, we get into the details a bit more, and I help you rate your triggers by comparing your symptoms on a scale that's used by the Centers for Anxiety Disorders. Now, just let me say something. PTSD is definitely present in grief. It's a real thing. Now, there's different degrees of PTSD, and there's a few different symptoms with PTSD in grief than PTSD that you might expect to see from someone in the military. And we go over that in detail in this module. Okay, but that is a severe reaction. Just let me mention that. That is on the severe scale of response. And I'll help you work through and recognize some of those symptoms in your workbook. However, if your triggers are impacting your life to the point that functioning on a day-to-day basis is altered, it's time to see a doctor. Okay, just don't mess around with it. Just go see a doctor. Okay, because that is a severe reaction, and it could put you in an environment that's not safe for you. And that may mean calling 911. But here's the thing, friend. Everything about grief is so unexpected. It throws you into a life you didn't want. Certainly one that you didn't see coming. And it can set you up for a lifelong struggle of managing anxiety and fear. Making the decision to do the hard work right now will produce results for you that is life-changing. It'll improve your outlook on life. It'll remove the overwhelm of the unexpected, and it will improve your relationships with your living family and friends. The course is self-guided. It has 6.5 hours of video content and an 83-page workbook. However, if you prefer, we can do this and work together. When you are checking out, you will have the option to work one-on-one with me as well. Now listen to me for a moment. This may be very uncomfortable for you because it's not easy to sit with the pain of grief. But when we allow the pain of grief to surface, then we can put words to it. When we're able to put words to our pain, it releases the pressure valve. This can be scary, I get it, but it will also allow you to begin to experience freedom from the control that is lording over you. Because this is what I know. What we think is impossible with man is not impossible for God. All things are possible with God. Mark 10:27. And that's all I have for you today, guys. So until next time, take care. Hey friend, I pray you heard something today that will give you strength for your journey. If so, would you take a few moments and share it with a friend who needs to hear it? And I'd love for you to leave a review on Apple Podcast. It gives me strength for my journey to hear that it's helping you. Remember, you're not alone. From my heart to yours, I'll meet you here next week. Bye-bye for now.